Have you ever felt like money seems to slip through your fingers, no matter how hard you work? Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you try, prosperity never arrives? What if I told you the secret to changing this isn't out there, but inside your mind? Today you'll learn the story of Sophie Baker, an ordinary woman who lived mired in debt, full of doubts and without hope, until the day she discovered something capable of completely transforming her financial life, the law of attraction. And when she began to apply this power, money began flowing in ways she never imagined possible. But what really changed? What led Sophie out of scarcity and into a flow of abundance? This story will show you that thriving isn't about luck. It's about energy, faith, and focus. And perhaps, as you listen to this journey, you'll realize that the same power is there too, within you, waiting to be awakened. Oh, and before we begin, tell me something. Are you already subscribed to this channel? If you're not, take advantage now. Subscribe, like, and comment below where in the world you're listening to this story from. I love knowing how far these messages of prosperity are reaching. Sophie Baker's journey is just beginning. And who knows, maybe in the end you too will discover that attracting abundance is much simpler than it seems. Sophie Baker was the kind of person who believed life was all about bills, appointments, and a hurried coffee before work. She lived in a small apartment surrounded by bills stuck to the refrigerator and dreams stored in drawers that never opened. Every day she wondered how some people managed to thrive while she barely made it to the end of the month. The sound of her alarm clock seemed to always echo the same routine, tired and predictable. Yet there was a silent longing inside her, almost forgotten, begging for something more. She worked in a simple clothing store where her salary barely covered the basics. When the paycheck arrived, the relief was short-lived. The money disappeared like sand through one's fingers. Even so, Sophie continued to smile at the customers, pretending everything was under control. Sometimes she looked at the window and wondered when life would stop being a window too, full of things she wanted but could never have. The emptiness in her chest was deeper than the negative balance in the bank. On her darkest days, Sophie would walk to the park near her home. She enjoyed watching people jogging, couples laughing, and the sun shining through the leaves. There she imagined the world was lighter, that perhaps there was a different path. But as soon as she returned home, reality would hit her again. The bills, the rent, the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle. It was as if the universe had forgotten her. But the curious thing is that, even when immersed in difficulties, Sophie had a special sensitivity. She noticed details that many people overlook: the smell of fresh coffee, a stranger's smile, the soft sound of falling rain. Little things that somehow kept her going. It was as if something invisible was pushing her to keep going, even without knowing where. Perhaps it was a greater force, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And it was precisely on one of those ordinary days, between despair and hope, that Sophie's story began to change. An unexpected encounter, a phrase spoken at the right moment, or perhaps a simple video that appeared by chance, no one knows for sure. But there, amidst the chaos, a new seed was planted, and without realizing it, Sophie was about to discover that the power to change her life had always been within her. Sophie's mornings began with a knot in her stomach. Even before breakfast, she was already thinking about the bills piling up and the clock that seemed to move faster than the money. The messages from the bank were almost always the same: insufficient balance, payment declined. It was a suffocating cycle, where every attempt to breathe seemed to bring a new worry, and yet she persisted in smiling, as if refusing to give up on her own story. There were days when Sophie found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would be like to live without that constant fear. The fear of opening her wallet and seeing empty, of not being able to afford the basics, of having to choose between buying food or paying a utility bill. She'd felt the shame of asking for help and the wounded pride of denying it when someone offered. All of this was shaping an invisible weight, unseen on her shoulders, but felt in her soul. The work, once a source of pride, began to feel like a prison. Each hour seemed longer than the last, and each hurried client left a bitter taste of dissatisfaction. Sophie looked at her watch and counted the minutes, wondering how much longer she had until the end of the day, and paradoxically until the end of the month. Time and money seemed to play hide and seek, always leaving her one step behind. Even when her paycheck arrived, the relief was short-lived. Her salary barely covered her fixed expenses, and any unexpected event was enough to unravel her entire control. Sophie tried to plan, make spreadsheets, cut expenses, but there was always something that escaped her calculations. It was like trying to hold water in her hands. And the harder she tried, the more But it was precisely at that moment, when exhaustion seemed to take over, that something began to change. A question began an echo within her, silent, insistent, almost stubborn. Does it always have to be like this? And this question, so simple and profound, would be the first step towards something much greater than she could yet imagine. Sophie grew up hearing that money was difficult, almost forbidden. In her home, phrases like "money doesn't grow on trees" and "lucky people are rich" echoed as absolute truths. From a young age, she learned that hard work was the only way, and even then, it didn't always work. These ideas took deep root, creating a limited view of what was possible. And without realizing it, Sophie carried these beliefs like invisible chains that tied her to the past. At work, she saw people prospering and wondered what was wrong with her. Am I incapable? She wondered silently, staring at her nearly empty bank statement. It was as if a wall stood between her and abundance, a wall built of fear, guilt, and distrust. She believed so strongly that money was difficult that the universe seemed to agree with her. And so the cycle repeated itself, like a mirror of her own convictions. Every time someone commented on her success, Sophie recoiled. It wasn't envy, it was disbelief. It seemed as distant as a star in the sky, beautiful to see, impossible to touch. She told herself she was unlucky, that she wasn't born for great things. The problem is that what's repeated in the mind, the universe understands as truth, and Sophie didn't yet know how much her words shaped her own reality. Even when she wanted to thrive, there was always an inner voice telling her, "This isn't for you." This voice, subtle and constant, was like a shadow that followed every step. It limited her decisions, undermined her confidence, and made her doubt her own worth. The fear of dreaming big was the shield that prevented any attempt at change. But it was precisely when she realized the weight of these beliefs that something began to awaken within her. A spark of curiosity emerged, as if an inner door were opening for the first time. Sophie began to wonder if everything she believed about money was actually true. And in this doubt, the beginning of a silent transformation was born, the harbinger of a new outlook on life. There were nights when Sophie would simply lie and stare at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The silence of the room seemed to scream her worries, and the thought that nothing would change made her feel small. Frustration was a constant visitor, the kind that arrives unannounced and decides to stay. She wondered where she had gone wrong. What was left to do? Deep down, she began to believe that perhaps life simply hadn't anything better in store for her. The days repeated themselves with the same predictability: work, bills, and the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle. Sophie felt like her effort was never enough, that the harder she ran, the more the ground slipped away from under her feet. The helplessness was disguised as fatigue, but it was more than that. It was an emotional weight that seeped into every gesture. Her smile, once natural, now seemed like a disguise to hide her discouragement. She tried to convince herself that everything would pass, but time only reinforced the idea that nothing changed. Each failed attempt left her farther from home. Money seemed like an uncontrollable force, coming and going as it pleased, regardless of her efforts. And the more she tried to control fate, the more it slipped away, leaving only the echo of a one. Sometimes Sophie found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror, wondering who she had become. That tired woman, with her dull gaze, seemed different from the dreamer who had once believed in possibilities. There was a silent pain there, made of renunciations and waiting, and even though she wouldn't admit it, something inside her cried out for change, for a sign, for a new beginning. And it was precisely in this mix of discouragement and desire that the universe decided to act. Because it's when the mind reaches its limit that the heart opens to the new. Sophie didn't know it yet, but that emptiness that so frightened her would be the perfect space for something extraordinary to blossom. And that something would come in a way she never imagines. It was on a random afternoon, one of those when life seems to go in circles, that Sophie had her first encounter with something different. While distractedly scrolling through social media, a video caught her eye. A woman talking about the power of the mind to attract prosperity. Sophie almost passed it by, finding it too fanciful, but something stopped her. There was a lightness in the woman's voice, a confidence that sounded impossible to fake. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie listened with her heart. The video spoke of a so-called law of attraction, an invisible force that responded to the frequency of thoughts. The more you think about scarcity, the more scarcity you attract. The more you vibrate with gratitude, the more the universe gives back. Sophie frowned, skeptical but curious. This challenged everything she believed, and at the same time, it seemed to make strange sense. Does thought really have that much power? She muttered to herself. In the days that followed, the idea wouldn't leave her mind. Between bus rides, between work and dinner, she found herself pondering that possibility. What would she lose by trying? Deep down, Sophie knew she'd tried everything. Saving, planning, putting in the effort. But she'd never tried to believe, and it was precisely that word that resonated within her, like a seed planted in fertile ground. That week, she searched for more videos, read articles, and delved into stories of people who had changed their lives. Each story sparked a spark of hope, but also raised doubts. What if it was all just coincidence? Still, Sophie felt something different, almost indescribable, a light energy, a good feeling. It was as if the universe was inviting her to a new beginning. And so, without really knowing why, Sophie decided to give it a try. She had nothing to lose, except the old beliefs that were keeping her trapped. It was the beginning of a small personal experiment, testing whether the mind could truly change her reality. Little did she know that by accepting this invisible invitation, she was about to enter the most transformative phase of her life. In the days that followed, Sophie couldn't get the thought out of her head. It was as if that message had left an invisible mark inside her. As she stocked the shelves at the store or walked home, the thought kept coming back. What if it's true? What if I really can change my life? It sounded unlikely, yet irresistible, and the more she tried to ignore it, the more the universe seemed to nudge her with little signs. One day she found a forgotten bill in the pocket of an old jacket, only $5, but enough to make her smile. Coincidence, she thought, trying to hide her astonishment. It was as if the universe were saying, "See, I'm listening." This small event ignited something inside her, a new, almost childlike glow, of someone beginning to believe again. For the first time in a long time, Sophie felt there was magic in everyday life. She began to observe the things around her more attentively. The sunset seemed more beautiful, the coffee tastier, the conversations more meaningful. It was as if the world had gained color. Sophie didn't know if it was the law of attraction or just a new way of seeing, but something in her had changed, and in this new perspective, a lightness she had never experienced before was born. Each video she watched, each sentence she read, seemed to push her a little deeper into this mysterious universe. She began jotting down words like gratitude, energy, and vibration in a small notebook. She didn't understand everything, but she felt she was on the right path. There was something deeply comforting in the idea that her thoughts could be the beginning of a new reality. And so, with her curiosity blossoming, Sophie found herself ready to take the next step. It wasn't enough to just believe or hear stories. She wanted to feel, experience it firsthand. The next step would be to put what she had learned into practice, even without fully understanding how it worked. And that's when true transformation began to take shape. One silent night, Sophie decided to try it for the first time. She sat on the edge of her bed, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath, trying to calm her whirlwind of thoughts. She remembered what she had learned, to feel as if desire were already real. At first she found it strange. Imagining something that didn't yet exist felt like a game of make-believe. But little by little she began to feel something different, a sweet tranquility taking over her chest. She visualized herself living a life of ease, with her bills paid, her closet full, and her heart at peace. She saw herself entering her home with a smile, opening a letter, and finding good financial news. She felt a thrill of security, as if the universe were enveloping her in a silent embrace. This wasn't just imagination. It was like tapping into an invisible frequency. For the first time, Sophie tasted abundance before she even had it. During the visualization, she realized the power of emotion. It was as if each thought had color, texture, and shape, and together they formed the backdrop of a new reality. Sophie understood that the secret wasn't in asking, but in feeling deeply, genuinely. Money, prosperity, well-being, everything seemed closer when she vibrated gratitude. It was at that moment that something shifted within her, even if she couldn't yet explain it. Over the next few days, Sophie began repeating the practice. Each night before bed, she immersed herself in this small ritual of hope. Sometimes she smiled to herself, imagining the future she desired, as if it were already here. Other times, she cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief, like someone finally understanding their own power. And with each session, the world seemed to respond in subtle ways. Small coincidences began to emerge: an unexpected phone call, an unlikely discount, a compliment at work. Nothing grand, but enough to make her believe something was moving. Sophie began to realize that the universe has its own way of responding, silent, patient, but accurate. And what came next would show her that gratitude isn't just a feeling, it's a bridge to change. It was through her visualization practices that Sophie discovered something even more powerful than imagining gratitude. At first it felt strange to be grateful for things she didn't yet have, but as she did, something inside her began to shift. Gratitude colored ordinary days and brought a sense of calm, as if everything was exactly where it should be. It was the first sign that the universe was responding to her vibration. Sophie started slowly, giving thanks for the little things: the hot coffee in the morning, a customer's smile, the sun shining through the shop window. As she jotted down each gratitude in her notebook, she felt the energy of the room shift. Things seemed lighter, people kinder, and even problems began to seem smaller. It was as if the simple act of giving thanks was an invisible key, opening doors she hadn't even known existed. Over time, she realized that gratitude wasn't just a practice, it was a state of being. When she gave thanks, fear gave way to confidence. What had previously been scarcity now became learning. Sophie began to understand that the more she recognized the good she already had, the more the universe found ways to multiply it. And this made her smile, like someone rediscovering a forgotten piece of herself. One morning as she wrote, "I'm grateful that I always have enough," she felt a shiver run through her body. It was a feeling hard to explain, a mixture of peace and certainty. For the first time, Sophie truly believed she wasn't alone on this journey. Something greater was guiding her, and that something seemed to respond directly to her vibration. And so it was that gratitude became part of her routine, like brushing her teeth or breathing. It fueled her mornings and comforted her nights. And the more she gave thanks, the more the universe found subtle ways to show it was listening. The next step, however, would be to realize how this new energy would begin to transform, not only her mind, but her entire reality. The changes began almost imperceptibly, like small breezes before a major transformation. Sophie began waking up feeling lighter, with a smile she couldn't even fathom. The same route to work seemed more beautiful, and even the sound of the city seemed different, less chaotic, more harmonious. It was as if the world was slowly responding to the new energy she emanated, and within her something was quietly blossoming. One day, the store manager praised her performance and mentioned a potential promotion. Sophie was surprised. No one had noticed her efforts in years. Another time, a neighbor brought her a cake, saying she felt like to thank you for your kindness. Simple things, but they seemed like perfect synchronicities. It was as if every gesture from the universe was saying, "Keep going, you're on the right path." The accounts curiously began to balance out. Money, previously scarce, seemed to last longer. Sophie still wasn't earning any more, but now she knew how to manage calmly, without despair. And when something unexpected happened, something happened. An opportunity, a discount, an unexpected favor. She began to realize that the flow of life moved according to her inner state. The more peace she felt, the more life flowed. Sophie's perspective also changed. Where before she saw problems, she now saw possibilities. That old sense of helplessness gave way to a calm curiosity about how the universe orchestrated everything. It was like watching a movie where suddenly the pieces began to fall into place. And the more she watched, the more she believed this wasn't coincidence. It was connection. And it was then that the universe, testing her newfound faith, decided to present Sophie with an unexpected challenge. Something that would momentarily shake her beliefs and show whether she had truly learned to trust. It would be the moment to prove that abundance doesn't come from the absence of problems, but from the strength to remain aligned even when the wind changes direction. Life, as it always does, decided to test Sophie's newfound faith. Everything seemed to be going well until unexpected news arrived. The store where she worked would be restructured, and part of the team would be laid off. Fear returned with a vengeance, like an ancient shadow trying to reclaim its place. For a moment, Sophie felt her heart tighten. Doubt whispered that perhaps all that law of attraction stuff was just an illusion. But amidst the panic, something inside her resisted. That night, instead of despairing, she took a deep breath and remembered the practices that had been transforming her life. She sat on the living room floor, closed her eyes, and decided to give thanks. She gave thanks for the job she had, for the lessons, for the livelihood it had brought. And through tears she said to herself, "I trust. The universe knows what it's doing." It was a simple phrase, but spoken from the heart, and that made all the difference. In the days that followed, fear still lingered, but now Sophie knew how to manage it. Whenever anxiety hit, she would repeat to herself, "Everything is aligning in my favor." And somehow life seemed to respond. Small signs appeared, a friend offering help, a new idea, a different energy in the air. And it was as if the universe was testing her confidence, just to show her she could go further. It was during this uncertain period that Sophie understood something profound. True faith isn't believing when everything is easy, but when nothing seems to make sense. And paradoxically, it was in this apparent chaos that she felt an inexplicable peace. The feeling of being guided, even without seeing the path, gave her the strength to continue. What had once been despair was now surrender. And then, when she least expected it, a new opportunity arose, a proposal that seemed tailor-made for her. It was as if life were saying, See, I just needed you to trust. Sophie realized that every loss brought a hidden gain, and that the universe always rewarded those who kept their hearts open. And from that moment on, she would understand that true power lay within her, about to blossom into a new consciousness. It was after that shock that Sophie truly understood. Thriving wasn't about luck, it was about belief. The layoff, which had previously seemed like a punishment, became a turning point. She began to see money not as scarce, but as energy in motion. And the more she vibrated with confidence, the more doors opened for her. It was as if the universe was saying, "Now you've got the hang of it." Sophie began to realize she no longer needed to chase money, she simply needed to align herself with the feeling of abundance. When she shifted her focus from fear to faith, the world around her responded. Old clients returned to her, new ideas began to emerge, and life began to move at a different pace. Her mind, once confused and anxious, now became the fertile ground where prosperity flourished. She began to observe her thoughts carefully, like someone tending a garden. When she noticed fear emerging, she replaced it with gratitude. When pessimism tried to creep in, she transformed it into hope. This new awareness completely shifted her energy. Sophie understood that the universe responds not to what one asks for, but to what one feels. And that changed everything. Over time, people around her began to notice the sparkle in her eyes, the lightness of her speech, her calm amidst uncertainty. Everything seemed different. Some thought she'd struck lucky, but Sophie knew better. It was her mind, finally aligned with the flow of life. And this inner shift began to attract new opportunities in ways she could never have anticipated. And it was then that she decided to take a step further. Not just believe, but consciously create. Sophie was ready to reprogram her thoughts, transform old beliefs, and build a solid prosperity mindset. What had once been instinct now became daily practice, and this new chapter would mark the beginning of a true inner revolution. Sophie realized that the mind was like a muscle. It needed constant training, so every morning before even checking her phone, she began the day with positive affirmations. She said out loud, "I am prosperous. Money flows easily to me. I deserve abundance." At first it seemed like mere rote repetition, but over time, the words began to gain strength. It was as if each phrase was a reminder of who she was becoming. She also learned to observe what she thought throughout the day. Whenever she noticed a negative thought, she took a deep breath and replaced it with something better. "I can do it. Everything is falling into place. The universe is watching over me." These were mantras she carried in her mind like shields, and the more she used them, the easier it became to stay aligned. What had once been an effort now became second nature. The gratitude notebook, which had previously held loose notes, was now a sacred ritual. Sophie wrote down the good things every day, even in the simplest situation. She learned that consistency was more important than intensity. It wasn't about grand gestures, but about keeping an open heart, even when nothing seemed to be happening. This mental discipline was the foundation of her new reality. Over time, she noticed something curious. The external world seemed to respond to her internal rhythm. When she was at peace, everything flowed. When she was distracted by fear, things stalled. This connection between mind and life fascinated her. It was as if the universe were a mirror, reflecting exactly what she felt. And the more she understood this, the lighter life became. But Sophie hadn't seen anything yet, because it was at that point when her thoughts aligned and her faith strengthened that something extraordinary began to happen. A revelation that would change not only her relationship with money, but the way she saw the world. And this discovery would come in a single instant of clarity, the kind that transforms everything from the inside out. It was one ordinary morning that Sophie had what she would call her turning point. As she wrote in her gratitude notebook, a phrase came to mind with inexplicable force. "Money is just energy. She stopped, dropped her pen, and was silent for a few seconds. It seemed simple, but it held profound wisdom. For the first time, Sophie understood that money was not an enemy. It was an extension of her own energy. The penny dropped in an almost physical way. If everything is energy, then money didn't need to be difficult. It flowed toward whatever vibrated in tune with it. Sophie realized that for years she had repelled prosperity with thoughts of fear and scarcity. Money, like a faithful reflection, simply obeyed her frequency. This realization opened a new horizon within her mind. From this insight, Sophie began to see life differently. Every thought became an energetic choice, every emotion a way to shape the future. She felt as if she had discovered the secret code to abundance. The universe wasn't cruel, just neutral. It gave back exactly what it received. And now that she understood this, it all seemed incredibly logical. This understanding brought a newfound lightness. Sophie stopped worrying so much about how things would happen. She began to focus on how she felt, and that made all the difference. Control gave way to trust, and fear to surrender. It was as if the universe said, "Now that you've learned to dance, let me guide your steps." And she finally allowed herself to be led. And it was in this new state of consciousness that Sophie felt the urge to act. Not out of obligation, but out of inspiration. Ideas began to blossom, plans took shape, and she felt a creative energy pulsing within her. She was ready to move beyond theory and live what she believed, and this impulse would give rise to the next chapter of her journey. Inspired action. With this new understanding thrumming within her, Sophie felt a different urge, no longer to chase, but to create. One afternoon, while drinking coffee, an idea came out of nowhere: to start selling custom clothing online. Before, she would have hesitated. Now she just smiled and thought, why not? It was one of those ideas born lightly, but carrying a silent purpose. She knew this impulse wasn't random. It was the universe calling. With few resources and a lot of faith, Sophie began. She gathered old fabrics, used her mother's inherited sewing machine, and created her first pieces. She posted them on social media, without expectations, just with the energy of someone having fun. And to her surprise, the first messages came in quickly. People complimenting her, asking for prices, placing orders. It was the universe responding to her newfound energy. Sophie realized that inspired action wasn't driven by haste, but by joy. Everything flowed naturally, effortlessly. She took pleasure in every step, choosing the fabrics, sewing, and carefully packaging. Time seemed to fly by when she was in this flow. And the more she followed this good feeling, the more opportunities seemed to arise spontaneously, like waves coming in at the right time. She didn't let obstacles get her down. When something went wrong, she took a deep breath and reminded herself, everything is falling into place. This new attitude made challenges lose their weight. Sophie understood that each apparent difficulty was just a gentle detour, leading her towards something better. The fear, once constant, was now just a distant echo. And so the little project grew. Friends began to spread the word, clients returned, and orders increased. Sophie felt she was finally in the flow of abundance, not because of the money itself, but because of the feeling of being aligned with what she loved. And what came next would prove that when the heart guides, the universe conspires to multiply. The first signs of prosperity began to appear so naturally that Sophie almost didn't notice. One client referred another, orders doubled, and the small business began generating more than her previous job. She laughed to herself when she saw the balance. Not because of the amount, but because of the feeling that finally everything made sense. It was as if the universe was confirming with each sale that she had found the right path. Her energy had completely shifted. Fear gave way to excitement, scarcity to confidence. Everything that had once seemed difficult now happened with ease. Sophie found herself waking up excited, with new ideas constantly emerging. Life, which had previously seemed gray, now had color, sound, and purpose. And for the first time, she didn't just believe in the law of attraction, she lived it. Coincidences also became part of her routine. The right people appeared at the right time, opportunities arrived effortlessly, and even money that had previously disappeared now multiplied. Sophie began to realize that prosperity wasn't about earning more, but about vibrating higher. Abundance was a natural consequence of her new state of being. With the concrete results came new challenges: organizing orders, managing deadlines, learning about business. But unlike before, she faced everything with serenity. Instead of despairing, she was grateful. And somehow, solutions always appeared at just the right time. It was as if the universe guided her step by step, at a perfectly orchestrated pace. And it was then that Sophie realized something even more profound. True wealth was not in what she had, but in what she felt. This understanding would give rise to a new learning curve, that of maintaining the energy of prosperity constantly, even when life tried to test her balance. And this would be the next chapter of her transformation. As her success grew, Sophie realized that maintaining balance was as important as achieving it. On good days, energy flowed naturally, but on challenging days, her mind still tried to resurface old fears. That's when she understood. The secret wasn't in never doubting, but in returning to alignment every time doubt arose. Emotional consistency became her new goal. It was the muscle of faith, now being strengthened. She created small rituals to keep her vibration high. In the morning, she would do short meditations, breathing and giving thanks, before starting her day. In the afternoon, she would mentally repeat her affirmations, and at night, she would write down what had gone well. These simple habits became anchors, constant reminders that prosperity was an internal state, not an external event. Sophie learned that if her mind was calm, everything else fell into place. When sales dropped or things didn't go as planned, she didn't let herself be shaken. Instead of despairing, she took a deep breath and told herself, "Everything is reorganizing in my favor." This phrase became a mantra of power, and curiously, it was always after these situations that something better emerged. It was as if the universe tested her stability before elevating her to a new level. Over time, Sophie began to perceive life as a continuous flow. She understood that the ups and downs weren't signs of failure, but of movement. Nothing was standing still. Everything was evolving, including her emotional constancy brought a sense of freedom, as if nothing could knock her off balance. Now the world could change around her. She would remain firm, centered, and confident. And it was during this period of equilibrium that Sophie experienced something that would transform her perspective even more profoundly. A moment when she looked in the mirror and recognized for the first time her own creative power. What had previously been a concept was now an experience, and this recognition would open the doors to the next step of her journey, the full awareness of who she truly was. Quiet morning, while organizing her orders, Sophie found herself smiling for no reason. That's when she realized she had become exactly the person she once admired in others' stories. The woman who believed, created, and thrived. And the beautiful thing is that this didn't happen overnight. It was the result of a new way of thinking, feeling, and acting. In that moment, she understood that the law of attraction was never outside of her, but always within. This recognition came like a gentle wave, washing over her heart with a sense of power and humility at the same time. Sophie understood that she had always been the creator of her own reality, even when things seemed out of control. The bad situations now seemed to have a purpose, to prepare her to see what she had always had. And the more she recognized this power, the more it grew. She realized that the prosperity she experienced was merely a reflection of something greater, her inner transformation. It all began with a thought, but blossomed with emotion and faith. Sophie felt she had finally broken the cycle of scarcity, the one that had existed for generations. Now in its place, a new cycle was born, that of conscious abundance, guided by love, gratitude, and purpose. People around her began to notice her change. Some asked her secret, others were simply inspired by her energy. Sophie responded with a smile, "I've just learned to watch my thoughts." It was simple, yet profound. The power lay in understanding that external reality was merely a mirror of the internal, and this set her free. And it was precisely in this freedom that she began to see the most beautiful fruits of her journey. Because when someone awakens to their own power, the universe conspires on even greater scales. Money, encounters, opportunities, everything began to align with an almost magical synchronicity, and this would be the beginning of the full manifestation of the prosperity she had dreamed of. Prosperity, when it finally manifested in Sophie's life, arrived sweetly and naturally, without fanfare, without haste. One day, she simply realized she no longer needed to worry about money. The bills were paid, the business was thriving, and her heart was at peace. But most incredible was the constant feeling of abundance, as if each breath brought a new blessing. It was the exact reflection of the peace she had cultivated within herself. Her small online store had grown into something bigger than she imagined. Sales grew so much that she needed to hire help, and orders began arriving from far away. The name Sophie Baker was no longer just a brand, it was a story of faith and transformation. Each piece she created seemed to carry the energy of the journey that brought her there. It was prosperity in art form. But what moved Sophie most wasn't the money itself, but the freedom of time, of choice, of being whoever she always wanted to be. She could help others, support causes, and still have time for herself. What had once been a distant dream was now her routine, and deep down she knew all of this wasn't luck. It was alignment, it was energy in action. People began to seek her advice, inspired by her journey, and Sophie, with the serenity of someone who has already understood the flow of life, would say, "It all starts within you. When you change within, the world changes with you." It was beautiful to see how her words touched hearts, just as other words had once touched hers. The cycle of inspiration was complete, and it was in that moment of plenitude that Sophie realized abundance was infinite, and she had simply learned to allow it to flow. But there was still one final lesson to be revealed, one that spoke not of material gains, but of something more subtle and lasting. The transformation that would come now would be internal, profound, and would forever change the way she viewed life. Over time, Sophie realized that true wealth lay not in the things she owned, but in the peace she felt upon waking each day. Money, once an obsession, was now merely a consequence of a balanced heart. She understood that prosperity wasn't about hoarding, but about flowing with life. The fear that once governed her choices was replaced by a calm confidence, almost silent, yet firm as the dawn. This inner transformation changed everything. Sophie no longer sought to prove anything to anyone, nor did she chase validation. She lived with purpose, guided by a deep sense of gratitude. Life seemed to speak to her constantly, through people, through encounters, through daily synchronicities. It was as if the universe was constantly telling her, "You understand what it means to be abundant." Instead of seeing challenges as punishments, she saw them as invitations to grow. When something went wrong, Sophie would smile, take a deep breath and say, "The universe is showing me something." This simple action transformed what would have been pain into a learning experience. And with each achievement, she felt more connected to herself, more confident in the power that resided within her. The feeling of lack disappeared completely. Sophie learned to trust the flow, without needing to control the outcome. She knew that everything arrived at the right time, in the perfect way. This peace of mind was the treasure she had always sought, and now, nothing seemed unattainable. Abundance, she understood, was a permanent state, not a passing moment. And it was then, in this meaningful silence, that she had a final revelation. Prosperity was merely a reflection of the harmony between mind and heart. When both work together, life becomes pure creation. And it was with this certainty that Sophie began to inspire others, never imagining that her story still held one final touch of magic, the finale that would crown her journey. On a golden late afternoon, Sophie walked through the same park where, years before, she had dreamed of a different life. The trees, the wind, the sound of children playing, everything seemed the same, but she knew better. Because the world outside had only changed after she had changed inside. She sat on the same bench, took a deep breath, and smiled. It was as if life were saying, "You did it." As she watched the sunset, she remembered her old self, the woman who feared, who doubted, who thought it impossible to attract prosperity with the power of her mind. She felt tenderness for her, as if looking at an old friend who had finally found her way. Because now Sophie knew the law of attraction isn't about wishing, it's about becoming. And she had become everything she had ever imagined. Money flows naturally, opportunities arrive effortlessly, and peace resides in her heart. But the most beautiful thing is that Sophie understands that none of this is the end. It's just the beginning of a new consciousness, a life where the impossible doesn't exist and where every thought is a seed of creation. She learned to live with purpose, and it made all the difference. Before leaving, she gave silent thanks, not for having achieved anything, but for having discovered who she truly was. The woman who once asked now emanated, the one who feared now trusted, the one who hoped now created. Everything was exactly as it should be. And in that moment, she felt something profound, a gentle certainty that the universe was smiling back. And so, with a heart full of gratitude, Sophie rose and continued on her way. The wind blew gently, as if applauding her journey, and as the sun set on the horizon, she understood once and for all. The secret to prosperity wasn't in the future. It was in every loving thought, every feeling of faith, in the now. And so ends the story of Sophie Baker, a woman who discovered that true prosperity begins within the mind. She understood that it wasn't the world that needed to change, but the way she saw herself in it. The law of attraction wasn't a miracle, it was a mirror, reflecting everything she chose to believe about herself. Sophie learned that wealth isn't just about the bank balance, but about the serenity of those who trust that the universe always conspires in their favor. Because when we change our feelings, our vibration changes. And when our vibration changes, the world changes with us. Abundance, after all, is a state of mind. And maybe if you've made it this far, this story didn't appear by chance. Maybe the universe is reminding you that you too are capable of creating a new reality. It all starts with a thought, a decision, a simple "I believe." So, if this story touched your heart, take this moment, subscribe to the channel, like it, and share what inspired you most in the comments. I want to know how Sophie's journey made you reflect on your own. Because in the end, every prosperity story begins the same way, with someone who decides to believe in the impossible and turns the impossible into destiny.